Hello, and welcome back to the final part of this 5-part series on Humankind's closed beta Industrial Era wonders. We're going to talk about the wonders in the Industrial Era in this final part, including Big Ben, the Eiffel Tower, and the Statue of Liberty. This is the only era so far where there are only 3 wonders. I believe there are only 3 confirmed for the contemporary era as well, where the previous eras all had 4. So a little bit less to talk about for this video. Before we dive in, let's first talk about what we're going to talk about. First, we'll talk about the unique effects of the wonder, including what are the immediate effects, so how useful is the wonder right when you get it, and how well does the wonder scale later into the game. We'll talk about the affinity or playstyle synergies, and I'll detail some of the better affinities that work well with those wonders, but it's not always going to be the best specific synergy in every single scenario you could possibly face. I'll also talk about some of the cultural synergies. This is, again, a non-exhaustive list, just meant to highlight some potential combinations that are going to be pretty reliably good. And finally, I'll also talk about combinations with other wonders. Additionally, all wonders provide plus 20 stability and plus 100 fame, so we're not going to talk about those specifically unless it relates to something else that the wonder provides. And we'll be using these symbols to denote the different affinities. You'll notice that there is a religious affinity, although there isn't actually an affinity for religion in the game. This is just because religion is a playstyle that you can pursue, even if it's not as explicit as the actual affinities that are listed as such in the game. But it is something that you need to devote significant effort to, but can also have pretty high yields and outputs if you decide you want to put in that effort. So I've included religious in this as well. These are really all these symbols are used to represent a style of play rather than like a specific affinity, right? So if you're thinking about an agrarian culture, yes, obviously someone like the Celts are agrarian, but someone like the Franks have a somewhat agrarian playstyle because of the plus 50% food on cities as their legacy trait. So don't think only in terms of cultures that have that specific affinity, but cultures that have bonuses that align with that kind of play. So let's talk about our very first Industrial Era wonder, which is Big Ben. Big Ben is going to provide you a flat plus 10% science, regardless of any other circumstance. It's also going to give you plus 10% science per alliance that you have, and that is empire-wide. Additionally, it's going to give you plus 10% science on your capital if your empire is in at least one alliance. What this means is that Big Ben is going to be really good if you have a lot of alliances, and it's even better the more science output that you have. Like any sort of percentage modifier, the modifier is more relevant the larger your base output is. So what you're really looking for with Big Ben is having a strong science output. Perhaps you chose the Joseon in the previous era, or perhaps the French in the current era, and you're looking to form a large number of alliances in order to boost your science output even farther and secure various borders, perhaps, to prevent invasions or to form alliances against a larger threat. So Big Ben actually works really well with aesthetes, because aesthetes have a lot of bonuses in order to ensure they're able to form alliances more readily. If you're looking at someone like the Italians or the Austro-Hungarians with the aesthete ability, they are able to get the AI to sign deals with them and potentially even form alliances. So they're going to be able to get greater benefit out of the plus 10% science per alliance. The aesthete, in this case, applies specifically to aesthete and not generally people who are good at generating influence. It also doesn't matter if you are an aesthete in the previous eras. It's only going to be relevant if you are an aesthete from the era in which you build Big Ben. Scientists, on the other hand, it doesn't matter as much when you picked the scientist as long as you have a strong science output. So even just plus 10% science, you're already getting half of the legacy trait of the French for free. And if you have a single alliance, you are getting the legacy trait of the French just by building Big Ben and having an alliance. and then you even have the potential to scale it farther than that. Alternatively, if you are the French and you build Big Ben, by having one alliance, you're effectively doubling the effect of your legacy trait. So Big Ben can provide a pretty massive boost to your science. So a few examples of cultures that work really well with Big Ben are going to be the French, obviously. They have a really strong base science output. They have a percentage modifier to their science. Even with just the plus 10% science, if you don't have any alliances, you might be able to make a case that Big Ben is worth it in that scenario. You could perhaps opt for Statue of Liberty instead, but if it's not available, the plus 10% science might be relevant. But ideally, obviously, you'd want an alliance. From the previous era, like I mentioned, the Joseon are pretty darn good. You're going to have a high base modifier for your, or a high base output for your science because of all the science you're going to get from the coastal waters, as well as the extra science you're getting from the Seiwan. So again, the Joseon pretty darn good with Big Ben. The Italians are one that fall into the aesthetes a bit. And it works well if you picked a strong science culture in previous eras because you can get both the benefits of a strong science output from, say, the early modern with the Joseon, and you go in and you pick the Italians, or the Austro-Hungarians will fill this role just as well. And by picking those cultures, you're able to form those alliances with the AI around you in order to pump up that percentage modifier even farther. Another good combination, if you have a more mixed economy and you're less focused on that science output, is going to be the Byzantines. The Byzantines get a legacy trait of plus 5% money per alliance that they're in. So by picking Big Ben, you get not only science for every alliance that you have, but also a modifier to your money. So the Byzantines, although it's not a direct modifier to science and it doesn't let you form alliances more easily, it's an additional incentive in order to form alliances. I'll also add that the Byzantines can combine with the statue of Zeus. So the statue of Zeus is a wonder that is going to give you plus 10% money per alliance that you have. So if you have the Byzantines, and you have Big Ben, and you have the statue of Zeus, for every alliance that you have, you're going to get plus 15% money and plus 10% science, in addition to plus 10% science on your capital and a base of plus 10% science from Big Ben. So really strong if you are pursuing a heavy alliance-based style of gameplay. Another good combination with Big Ben is the Statue of Liberty. Now, the Statue of Liberty is going to provide you with plus 1% science and money for every territory under your sphere of influence. So like I said, Big Ben is something that is actually really good with aesthetes because of their ability to form alliances. But aesthetes are also naturally more able to expand their sphere of influence because of their high influence output. So not only are you going to be able to form more alliances, but with the Statue of Liberty, which we'll talk about more in a minute, you're also more likely to have more territories under your sphere of influence, which means you're going to get even more modifiers out of the Statue of Liberty that'll combine with Big Ben. Finally, from older eras, we have the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, and this is a wonder that provides you plus 1% science per district. So the Museum of Halicarnassus probably best built in your capital, and then you can get Big Ben, the additional plus 10% science on top of it if you're in an alliance. And in every game, you're going to have districts. You're going to have plenty of them. Builders are going to benefit more than others, or people with a lot of stability buffs. But the Mausoleum combined with Big Ben can give you a ridiculous science output. And if you can manage to snag Big Ben and the Mausoleum and the Statue of Liberty, you are going to have pretty much unrivaled science output in the game. No one's going to be able to catch up to you unless they've really hard focused science and you haven't picked like any scientist cultures the entire game. So Big Ben, overall, a strong wonder, very single-minded in its focus, looking for a science-based game that's going to be more peaceful. So Big Ben, you're probably looking to expand less than you might with other wonders because it's going to be a bit of a detriment since you can't form an alliance with people you're at war with. So next, let's talk about the Eiffel Tower. The Eiffel Tower is pretty simple in its effect. It simply gives +1 industry per population on all your cities. You might think, looking at this, that this is going to combine really well with builders, but that is a trap. And I'm going to get into the math of this in a minute, but first let's talk about what the Eiffel Tower is actually good with. The Eiffel Tower is good for agrarians, because in order to take maximum advantage of the Eiffel Tower, you really need a lot of population to recoup your investment in a reasonable amount of time. So the Eiffel Tower comes pretty late in the game, and because you have to build stuff with production and you're getting production out of it, you can really get a one-to-one conversion of how much value you're getting by building the Eiffel Tower, and I'll show you a little bit of simplified math for that. So with the agrarians, you're able to more readily pay off the investments you make in the Eiffel Tower. The other group that is able to do this are people that have really focused on capturing other people's cities, so militarists and expansionists, or just other people that have perhaps founded a lot of cities, so therefore have more population. But generally, if you have a lot of cities, chances are it's from expansionism, and with that expansionism is going to come more population. And the Eiffel Tower, as you expand, is going to get more valuable because you're going to conquer more cities that benefit from the +1 industry. So, cultures that benefit from this, you'll notice a lot here, really, and virtually all of them have one thing in common, which is that they are all really good at generating food. The Celts have the Nemeton, which gives +1 food per population. The Franks have +50% food on their cities. The Haudenosaunee get extra food from farmers, as well as the Three Sisters plantation. The Mexicans get a +20% food flat, as well as the Hacienda, which generates additional food. The Khmer are a bit of an odd one out, but I actually think one of the stronger synergies here, because they have the Beret, which gives them industry per population already, and the Beret is going to give them food for every district that they have in their city. You'll notice, however, something that's really odd about the design of the Eiffel Tower, which is that the Khmer from 2 eras earlier actually get an emblematic quarter that gives +1 industry per population, as well as other effects on top of it for much lower cost. And really, in a city, you can probably have 3 to 5 of these in your main cities. So you're going to be getting +3 to +5 industry per population already. So the relative effect of the Eiffel Tower, if you have a bunch of berets, is going to be much lower in percentage terms than if you just have a lot of food with not as much production. And here's some simplified math to show what I mean. So let's consider 2 players. So both players are going to have 10 cities. Player 1 has 300 pops, and player 2 has 500 pops. Because player 1 has focused on builder cultures and production since the start of the game, we'll say player 1 has 1,000 average production per city. Well, player 2 has 500 average production per city because they focus more on growing their cities and picking agrarian cultures. Now, if we look at the time to build the Eiffel Tower for player 1 and player 2, player 1 will build it in 3 turns, where player 2 will build it in 5. Player 1 will get 300 production, where player 2 will get 500. Player 1, because they already have much higher production, only get a 3% increase in their production capabilities by building the Eiffel Tower. If their population stays the same through the entire game, which is, a simplification, but let's just say it stays at 300 population for the rest of the game, it's going to take 75 turns for the Eiffel Tower to pay off. And if you've built the Eiffel Tower, you generally only have somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 turns remaining in the game. Player 2, meanwhile, they get a 10% increase in their production with their 500 pops, and they'll pay it off in about 45 turns. So that'll leave you with somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 turns left to recoup your investment. So the increase in production here is pretty negligible for cultures that already have high production output. And that percentage increase is only going to get worse the more production you already have. Whereas the increase in production for a low production, high population culture is going to be a lot more substantial. I do think there is still the question of whether or not the Eiffel Tower is going to be worth building. You do need to have a lot of population, and 500 population going into the industrial era is really quite a lot from what we've seen in the betas and the open devs coming up to this point. 500 pop is pretty generous, unless you've really started to find your way to game the AI and conquer cities and take all the population and that kind of stuff. So long term, the payoff of this is somewhat questionable, in my opinion. I think the Eiffel Tower is going to be the least reliable of the wonders in the industrial era. Now, obviously, your population isn't going to be static, right? If you have 300 population going into the industrial era, you're going to gain population as the eras go on, particularly once you start conquering cities. And that's going to reduce the time it takes to pay off the value of building the Eiffel Tower, right? It has something along the lines of 22,400 production cost, if I'm not mistaken, which is quite expensive. Wonders get very expensive later in the game. The lower production you already have, the less time you have to make it pay off as well, because it's going to take you longer to build. So if it were to take you 10 turns to build, you only have 90 turns left to get the value out of it. Whereas if you can build it in 5 turns, you have 95 turns, and so on and so forth. I am not really convinced the Eiffel Tower is good yet. I do think it's going to be a bit of a trap for new players that see that production and think, oh boy. But I think the effect as it is might end up coming a little bit too late in the game to actually be worth it relative to some of the other wonders. And particularly as the eras go on, and once we get into the industrial in particular, what we've seen in the most recent beta was that production kind of declines a little bit in value relative to money. Money becomes quite efficient at buying things out, whereas production costs can get quite high, particularly in your sort of non-core cities that perhaps have less infrastructure and quarters and lower population. And the Eiffel Tower distributes all that production among your entire empire. And in reality, production is generally better when it's concentrated rather than distributed. So unlike science, where it doesn't really matter as much where it comes from unless you're having modifiers that are specific to a single city, it all ends up going to the same pool, right? It doesn't matter if you're getting +1 science from your main city or +1 science from a city you just conquered. It all has the same effect when it comes to researching the next technology. But when it comes to production, getting a little bit of a benefit everywhere isn't quite as powerful as getting a lot of a benefit in a single place. And say on your main city you have, 1,000 production and you're getting +30 industry or +40 industry there. Is it really worth all that much given how late in the game it comes? Yeah, I'm not sure. I think we'll have to see just how much population scales later in the game in the contemporary era to really get a handle on this, to see how good some of these infrastructures are to boost up your population. At the moment, though, I'm not sold on Eiffel Tower. That said, let's talk about some of the wonder synergies. So first is the Topkapi Palace. And Topkapi Palace provides a flat +5% industry and +100% industry towards shared projects. And actually, if you are someone that's focused on production and you have cities that are like 2,000 to 4,000 production, which is something that's achievable by the time that you can build both the Eiffel Tower and Topkapi Palace, the Topkapi Palace is actually going to give you a better boost to your industry than the Eiffel Tower. But if you do combine both of these things, obviously you're boosting the production that you get from your population as well. And additionally, that production is going to be doubled when you're building the national projects. Another one is Angkor Wat, and Angkor Wat is going to provide you with +1 food per faith. So in cities that this is benefiting, which will probably be your capital or perhaps another one that you wanted to grow for whatever reason, the Angkor Wat is going to help support a higher population that you can get more industry out of from the Eiffel Tower. Now, the real one, I think the best synergy with the Eiffel Tower is Machu Picchu. And if you remember from my previous video, I talked about how the wording on Machu Picchu is a little bit deceptive. So Machu Picchu says that it redistributes 50% of the food from the city it's built in to other cities. But this doesn't mean that it is equally distributed and breaks down as you get more and more cities. If you have a city with 200 food, it redistributes 100 food to every single city. Every other city that you have is going to get 100 food. It doesn't keep getting smaller as you get more cities. So Machu Picchu really gives you this incredible growth potential that Eiffel Tower really benefits from. And I think it'll be one of those cases where this will actually be a wonder combination that people will sacrifice a lot to get. I'm not sure how much it'll pay off in multiplayer because Machu Picchu can make you exceptionally vulnerable if you lose the city in which Machu Picchu is built. But in single player, I do think this will be a particularly powerful synergy here, just because the time it'll take you to pay off the Eiffel Tower is going to be dramatically decreased compared to some of the other wonders. So next, let's talk about the Statue of Liberty. So the Statue of Liberty is going to provide you with +1% money per number of territories in your sphere of influence and +1% science per number of territories in your sphere of influence. And you'll notice that the Statue of Liberty has a lot of affinities and playstyles that it works well with for various reasons. So the aesthetes and agrarians both have higher influence production. So the aesthetes, this is obvious, right? They often have quarters or other bonuses that are going to give them a lot of influence that allows them to grow their sphere of influence. The agrarians are a little bit less obvious. In Humankind, every population that you have is going to give you +1 influence as a base, or if you are at 90% plus stability, your pops give you +2 influence. So by virtue of having a higher population, and therefore higher influence output, it means agrarians are actually more likely to have a larger sphere of influence than many of the other cultures in the game. Meanwhile, the merchants and scientists both work well with this if you've taken either or a combination of both throughout the course of the game, because they have higher base science and money output that are going to benefit from that percentage modifier. So this is a question of, say you're agrarians and you have, I don't know, this is just an example, 1,000 science output, which would be ridiculously low for that point in the game. But just for simplicity's sake, let's say you're an agrarian with 1,000 science output, or you are a scientist with 5,000 science output. Would you rather get a 20% modifier on your 1,000 science output or a 10% modifier on your 5,000 science output? Right, the answer is the 10% modifier on 5,000 science. So by having a higher base output, you're going to get a lot more benefit out of a percentage modifier, whereas a base modifier, a modifier that gives you +1 money or +1 food or +1 science or whatever, is going to benefit the cultures that are behind on those outputs. Additionally, militarists and expansionists work well for this as well. So when you control more territory and cities, you have more population, you have more emblematic quarters that you've taken from others that are going to be generating you influence, and you're going to have some advantages when it comes to pushing your sphere of influence. So Statue of Liberty, as you expand, you're probably going to continue to get benefits out of it, and it's going to apply to all the yields that you get off people as you conquer their cities. So as far as what cultures this works with, I mean, it's pretty much anyone, but let's put a few notables here. The first is going to be the Indians in the contemporary era, and we haven't seen the Indians in action yet, but the Indians get plus 10% money per number of territories in their sphere of influence. Yeah. But seriously, it's an insane modifier. So the synergy with Statue of Liberty here should be really obvious. In the era in which it's built, Statue of Liberty has two main aesthete cultures that'll work really well because of their ability to expand their sphere of influence with their influence generation, which is the Italians and the Austro-Hungarians, between either their legacy trait or their emblematic quarter. Additionally, in the previous era, you have the Ming and the Edo Japanese. The Ming and Edo Japanese both get massive influence boosts based on the number of quarters that they have in their cities. Finally, I also put the French up here because, again, they already have such a strong science output and a base science modifier, plus 20%, just as their legacy trait. So being able to stack additional modifiers on top of that can just make your science output absolutely outrageous. So, finally, we come to the wonder synergies for the Statue of Liberty. First and most obvious is going to be the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus. Mausoleum, like I've mentioned before, gives you that plus 1% science per district. Plop it down in your capital, plus plop down the Statue of Liberty. Enjoy a lot of science output. Again, with Big Ben, which I talked about already, so I won't go into too much detail, but you can get a lot of alliances and just rocket your science output up even further. If you're looking for money, the other two options are going to be the Taj Mahal, which will give you plus 50% money on cities that have 90% or more stability. And the Statue of Zeus is going to give you plus 10% money per alliance. So there are a lot of different combinations with Statue of Liberty. Your sphere of influence generally is going to be fairly large by this point in the game, just by virtue of having a lot of cities. It'll be pretty difficult from what we've seen to have a really small sphere of influence. The AI just aren't that good at pushing their culture onto you and expanding their sphere of influence. You'll pretty reliably be able to get the benefits from the Statue of Liberty. And in my opinion, it is probably the best and most versatile of the wonders in this era. It really can work well for just about anyone. I'd recommend building it in most games that you can get your hands on it. In multiplayer, perhaps not as much. It's going to depend on who your neighbors are and how good your sphere of influence is. We'll have to see how sphere of influence works when it comes to multiplayer, when people might actually pursue that as a legitimate strategy. But I suspect in most cases it'll probably be pretty good. Most cultures are able to at least defend themselves from too much intrusion on their sphere of influence, and if you can't, you're probably losing the game already anyway. So, with that brings us to the end of this discussion. Please let me know what you thought in the comments, if there are any synergies that I missed, anything that I overlooked, anything that you disagreed with. I like to take into consideration feedback and all those different viewpoints. Thanks for tuning in for this short series on the wonders that we've seen so far. We'll be reevaluating these wonders once the game is released, along with the cultures, religions, so on and so forth. We'll be providing some live gameplay as well. I'll be getting into a little more detail about what to expect on the channel once the game's released in another video. Thanks for tuning in, and keep an eye out for the next video. It'll come up hopefully sooner than later.